Welcome back. This is the overview of world history part 2. This is the stuff that we're going to learn during the second semester, and it's the stuff that we talked about today in class. The first question is, how did imperialism lead to World War I? Imperialism is just another name for the continuation of colonies, and the countries of Europe took over colonies all over the world. It started out in America. Spain and Portugal largely took over the Americas. And then later on, countries in Europe took over places in Asia, Indonesia, India, etc. And then eventually in the 1900s, places in Europe took over places in Africa. And you can see that here on this map. France, for example, took over all these areas in pink. England took over all these areas in yellow. Germany in green, etc. So you can see down here which countries took over what. Those different countries fought each other in order to get different colonies. So, for example, Britain and Germany fought each other over this land right here. Britain wanted to have it, Germany claimed it. Britain and Germany fought over this area right here. Germany claimed it, Britain wanted to have it. So on and so forth. Up here, between Cameroon and French Equatorial Africa, the French and the Germans fought each other over where this border should be. Each of these countries developed a sense of nationalist pride. The British were proud to own Egypt. The French were proud to own Algeria. And they fought each other in the colonies, believing that they were super strong. But what they really were doing is having the people of the colonies fight each other. So you have this thing that's going on over here, where all these dead bodies represent African people. And then this fat guy here is England, and this other fat guy here is probably Germany based on his hat. And the two of them are looking out over all of their colonies, and they're thinking about, from the European perspective, how powerful they are. But really, the victories over these colonized people made men like them feel strong, even though they weren't actually strong. How did imperialism lead to World War I is our question, and imperialism led the French and the British and the Germans to compete in Africa, but it also led them to compete with each other. Eventually, these victories made them overconfident, and eventually it made them compete with each other inside Europe. The next question is, how did World War I show us that nationalism leads to racism? So World War I started between France and Germany and in 1914, and it very quickly involved the entire world. The French, when they started running out of French soldiers, went to Senegal and recruited soldiers from the French colony of Senegal. And that's this picture here. The Germans started running out of German troops. They recruited Tanzanians. That's what's going on here. The British needed more troops. They recruited from India, their colony, which is represented here. Imperialism made the Europeans feel superior to everyone in the world and to each other. The French thought they were better, the Germans thought they were better, the British thought they were better, etc. Nationalism and racism were the excuses they gave for dominating the colonies. Why should the British be in charge of India? Well, because Indians are stupid, is the racist answer. Why should France be in charge of the Senegalese people? Well, because the Senegalese are stupid, is the reasoning, is the racist reason the French would give you. But then the colonies ended up having to send soldiers to help the French and the Germans and the British in Europe to fight their war. When those soldiers got to Europe, they experienced even more racism because French people didn't like having Senegalese soldiers in France. And similarly, German people didn't like having Tanzanian or even Herero or other groups of Africans as soldiers inside Europe. And so having people from the colonies come to Europe to help with the war led to more racism because white people in Europe didn't want to see Black people, people of color, Indian people of any kind fighting and being heroes. They developed even more racism as a way to feel not guilty about the way they treated the people in the colonies. They tried to find reasons to be even more racist and to not feel guilty about dominating all of these peoples. And they started to use science to try to justify their racism. And this develops into a whole field called eugenics, which is where you decide in a pretend scientific way that races of people not only exist, but some are smart and some are stupid, some are better and some are worse. And this gets used in the US even as well. Our last group here, these are soldiers from the US. They're known as the Harlem Hellfighters, an African American group of soldiers that came from Harlem in New York, and they also experienced almost the same kind of racism. Slide number 3. How was World War II a last attempt for imperialism? Imperialism was that whole thing where people had colonies. Spain and Portugal had colonies in America, and then they all declared independence. Britain and France had colonies in India or in Vietnam, and then they got independence later. World War II was a last attempt for imperialism because here we have Japan, and they took over Korea and then Manchuria and then areas in China and Vietnam because Japan wanted an empire. They wanted colonies. They wanted land to take resources from. In Europe at the same time, Germany here in the middle wanted land to take resources from, to put people on, to settle, or to have as colonies. And so Germany took over Czechoslovakia and Poland and then more and more and more and more and more. This cartoon here kind of shows us this thinking. Here's the French people in their country and the British people in their country, but this is supposed to represent Germany. And look at how many German people there are smushed inside their little tiny country. They need more room. So World War II started because Japan and Germany, and also Italy a little bit, tried to take over more and more land and get an empire for themselves. And Britain and France and the US and a couple of other countries put a stop to it. They said, no, you can't have an empire. We already have an empire. It's ours. It's not yours. Stop it. Slide number 4. At the end of World War II, we had a thing called the Cold War. In the Cold War, what happened to those former colonies who gained independence? Well, after World War II, a lot of places that were colonies got their independence. For example, India. Or, for example, Vietnam. Or Korea. Those former colonies who got independence now had to sort of choose sides in the Cold War. So the Cold War started between the USSR, here in red, and the NATO countries here in dark blue. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You don't need to know that. Usually we just say it's the US versus Russia, and we just know that England and France, etc., are on the US side. So we have the dark blue countries, which are led by the US, and we call ourselves the first world because we're number one and we're awesome. And then we're fighting a war against the Soviet Union, Russia, which we call the second world, because they're second best to us. And then everyone else in the world is called the third world. And these third world countries are pretty much all places that used to be colonies. The third world countries, let's just pick Africa for a minute here, are all countries that used to be colonies that are now independent, and then they have to choose in the Cold War, which side are they going to be on? The US side or the Russia side? And the Cold War is called a Cold War because the US and Russia don't actually shoot at each other or fight each other. They spy on each other and they try to get allies to help them out, but they don't actually have a full-on hot war. Instead, they fight inside their allied countries. So let's look at Korea over here. In Korea, they gained independence from Japan at the end of World War II, and the north half sided with the Soviet Union, and the south half sided with the United States. And so inside of Korea, it was not a Cold War. It was a very hot war. And in fact, that war is still happening today. Similar thing happened in Vietnam. Similar thing happened in some of these Central African countries. Similar thing happens in Germany. So these countries that used to be colonies, though, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia, they fight each other on behalf of Russia and the United States. Russia and the United States don't fight each other. They just give guns and weapons and supplies to their friends. And then they have their friends and allies fight each other in Africa or in Asia. Last slide, slide number 5. How do we see the damage of enslavement and colonization in the world today? Well, if we look at this map from 2018, it shows us the percentage of the population in that place living on less than $2 per day. So in places like the United States, where we are right now, it says over here that about 2% of the population is living on less than $2 per day. And then if you look at Mexico, the country right next to us, it says that 5% of their population is living on less than $2 a day. So what that tells us is that on average, there are more Mexican people living in poverty than United States people. And then also, as it goes down to the yellow color, it says like Colombia, for example, here, it has 20% of the population living on less than $2 per day. So you could say that Colombia, on average, is even poorer than Mexico, which is even poorer than the United States. What I want you to look at is this entire map and think about which places were colonies and which places were colonizers. And you can kind of compare, for example, Spain is wealthier than all the places that used to be Spanish colonies, except for Argentina and Chile and Uruguay, a couple places. France here is wealthier than the places it colonized down here, Senegal and Nigeria, and well, I guess that was a British colony. So Britain is richer than Nigeria, which was their colony. Germany today is wealthier than Namibia. Britain today is wealthier than India. So what do you see in the world today that proves that centuries of enslavement and centuries of colonization caused damage to the people who live in those places even today? That's the end of the 5 slides for today. If you're watching this after class and you need to go back and rewatch something, hopefully the video makes that possible. And I hope that you also are able to pause between each slide to write down your notes and write down your summaries as best as you can.